Hi. Let's see. Can you hear me okay? I cannot hear you right now. I can see you. Make sure sound is off. Okay. Mm-mm. You can hear me right now? Huh. Maybe. Meeting settings. Well. It says your mic's muted. Like, like mine has the mic button. Yours has like the mic with the line through it. Like it's not. I'm gonna be on Zoom on the my. Oh, did I have something? Nope. I'm gonna try to log in on my laptop and see if that. Okay. Oh, I got you. No, I got you. I hear you.
You can hear me?
I can hear you.
Oh my God. This has never happened. I'm like, what the frick nasty's going on here? All right, great.
No, I am not technology savvy, so.
You're not either, yeah.
No, not a fan.
Golly. I've not been more excited about an interview in a long, I love all my interviews, but I'm like, I'm so excited to learn more. So I was like, this better work.
Oh yeah, we would have figured it out, but we got it.
We got it. All right. So I'm going to let you introduce yourself. I was looking on social media and stuff, and I was like, I'm not sure how I'll introduce her. But today we are speaking with a death midwife and so much more, right? You teach yoga. You're a mom of two beautiful little boys. But why don't you speak to the audience of who you are and what you do?
Sure. Yeah. So my name is Lauren, and like Dawn said, I'm a mama first and foremost. I've been a yoga instructor with House of Om for about 5 years, and that's kind of how Dawn and I were connected through Melissa and House of Om, and then been working and developing, how I want to practice community service in like all the ways, and bring some traditions in my family to the community. And that's kind of how this death midwife practice came about for me personally, and what I'm trying to share with my community now.
Ooh, I love that. Systemic changes. So important. I still don't even know. On an individual basis or empowering women, but to go into there's so many areas in our society right now, the old era, that need reworking, right? The education system, I can go into all the systems, but the dying process, is one that I've personally, I know hospice has been a beautiful help, and I also knew there was something more, right? I'm watching people I love go through these slow deaths feeling powerless, and I know that there has to be that has to be common. I watched a documentary not too long ago about how the Western world really has lost their intimacy with death, and that, you know, it's just
Absolutely.
kind of avoided until until it's happening. And then and then what happens, right? People seem to be in
Yeah.
shock, feeling powerless. So that's why I'm excited about this. So
Yeah, and that's all I'm trying to do at the root of everything, right? So death midwife work isn't regulated by the government, and yet, maybe it'll try to be, but we keep on fighting against that. So because there aren't like strict regulations, the beautiful thing about it is, um, everyone can be a midwife. Every woman is one already. They don't know it, but you can look back when we talk about what that means, what the work entails. Um, you've already done it, most likely, because it kind of reverts back to, even though it's a newer way of thinking from what we view as normal right now in this country, in this society, all we're doing is going back 200 years when women did care for their dead. That's what a parlor room served as, was the place to hold a vigil and a funeral for someone before there became a death industry. So when I talk about the definitions of what a death midwife is, or what that can look like, entail, and all the avenues and how they can support their own loved ones or further out in the community, all of these things, you'll probably point to something that you've already done for someone, right? Because although continuing education is great, it's always important to be a student and learn things. And when it comes to death, there are some legal things to keep in mind in the state of Ohio, particularly, or whatever state you work in. We don't always want to break the law. Sometimes we do, but not always.
I love that.
Right? That'll be my, no, we don't want to break the law. Yeah, that's what I'm supposed to say. But yeah, so there is continuing education is important for so many reasons, but at the root of it, it's so natural and it's so intended to be personal, more personal than it is right now, that everyone will probably be able to point back to an experience and said, oh yeah, that sounds like death midwife work now that you talk about that definition, or I've done that when I was caring for my grandmother, or did it, so it's just getting back to that natural way of being when it comes to how we care for people who are dying when it is not an emergency, um, and then how we prepare and how we view death from a perspective of having fear or anxiety, doing more mundane tasks around that, just to alleviate some of the anxiety that comes up for our loved ones when we are going to be faced with death, because we're not gonna not be faced with death, right? It's
Every
one of
one of
those
us
things.
everyone gets born and everyone dies. So
Absolutely. And so since it's one of those things, it's such a commonality, we need to talk about it more, and we need to have more positive views about it, because positive sounds like a weird word to associate with death. But when you take back control and a bodily autonomy, for how you might want to die, and how you want things around you to happen when you might not even be in a position in the future where you might not be able to speak it yourself in that moment, it really can bring a lot of comfort to that individual. And that's what, to put on like the psychology hat for a second, there's a reason other cultures, other countries still do some more traditional ways of dying. There is a particular culture um, near in the area of Haiti, and they dig up their loved one after a certain amount of time, and they bring them out for a couple weeks once a year, and the kids get to touch and see what death and decay looks like. And then science and researchers are like, why are they doing that? And it's like, well, they have such an understanding and such a grasp on death and dying from a physical perspective, that there's emotional healing that happens when we get to participate in death, when we don't take a body away from us and we don't know what's happening with that body. We don't know, the last time we saw them, they were well, and now we see them and they're in a casket. There's these steps that, when we take back and perform the vigil, the home funeral, those types of practices for our loved ones and for our community and for each other, our senses get to be engulfed in the experience, and it helps really with beginning that grieving process, or it kind of reduces some of that initial shock. Sometimes it helps us to feel a body and touch a body and care for a body that is no longer physically breathing in this world. And it does our senses good, and it does our emotions good. And so there's some, science behind that, but at the root of it, it's just community care. It's just caring for one another.
Love that. I love
Yeah.
that. When I had my baby, it was, 15 years ago, and it was just on the precipice, just on the cusp of midwifery for birth and doulas, and all my, I watched The Business of Being Born, and right after I had her, this horrible death, well, it felt like a death. I actually almost died giving birth.
Yeah.
But this horrible process that was medicalized, no personal touches to it, and it was very, very traumatic. And so I think, me being a medicine woman and doing a lot, tapping in all day, looking at people's, their past lives or past situations, it gives me access to visions of actual women bathing the body
Absolutely.
and people dying in the background, and people are just going along with the cooking, and so it's not separated. And
Yeah.
I loved what you said about the grief piece too, because, especially now with COVID, there's no funerals, there's no ritual. I mean, we're almost going from the pendulum swinging from one way to the other. And how do people grieve, when there
Yeah.
is that reality that it actually happened? I remember when
Yeah.
my dad died, I thought for the first year, he's just probably still in the hospital, like that's the way my brain dealt with it. The grief
Sure.
process
Sure.
was so long.
Yeah. Yeah. And it's funny that you brought up birth and birth midwives and birth doulas.
It feels like the same thing, right?
It
Come
really
into
is
the
the
world,
same
leave the
thing,
world.
right? It is the same thing. When a woman is giving birth, they are laboring. Their breath is different, right? They're crossing thresholds to bring this life into this earth and this threshold, this reality that we see and know. And then that's fairly common now, right? But birth midwives are fairly normal practice, and death
It's
midwives are
come
doing
back.
this.
I want to
Yeah,
celebrate
yeah,
that,
yeah,
that it's come back in the last fifth decade. Yeah.
yeah. And then death midwives, it's essentially the same. We're an advocate. We're there. We're helping them labor. It's a different type of labor, but it's still if you've ever been with someone who is actively dying when it's not an emergency, and they are in like comfort care, and they're receiving morphine for pain and they're passing naturally, there is labored breathing that occurs, and you're standing there and you're supporting that threshold as well. So it's the same thing. And those again are the only two common experiences that we can all for sure say that we have in life. So there's, like you said, in the last decade, more acceptance around birth midwives. And so now is the time to bring some more acceptance around death midwifery as well.
Yeah, that breathing you're talking about, the death rattle, I think is one term people call it. And it's so intense. And that's why I
Yeah.
really was like, we need to start to get information out to the public, what to expect, because we're probably going to all, like you said, all experience death. My father died when I was in my early 20s. So it was a shock to me. I didn't understand what was going on. I remember the hospice coming in and giving me a pamphlet, and it's like, man, I wish I would have known what the body was going to do maybe
Sure.
before I'm in the last weeks with my dad.
Yeah.
And so I'm
Yeah.
frantically looking for the physical part. The toes are going to do this is going to happen. And I just wish that there was, or my vision is that, like you said, it becomes like the people in Haiti, it becomes a little bit more of an education process before, or maybe during, but it would have been
Yeah.
nice to have that before, and then there's that
Yeah.
powerlessness when someone's dying. That's what I was wanting to hear from you. One of the things the most is, what do what you were talking about, the little rituals, but there's this
Mm-hmm.
powerlessness of being able to help when people are suffering, giving birth or dying. What do you recommend for people listening that they can do for their loved ones?
Um, when I think of the word powerless, why are we powerless, or why do we feel powerless? And not that I to tell anyone that they should or shouldn't feel something, but that is a common feeling, right? So what can we collectively, we're looking at that particular feeling because there's many people have felt that way. So let's name what that is, what that feeling is, and then take a look at how can we pull back from that or maybe shift that or change that? And my answer to that is knowledge is power and practice is power. Obviously, you don't want to have a lot of practice with death and dying if you're not maybe going into the field professionally in some way. That's not it's a scar you bear, I guess, but not one you necessarily look out seeking for. But that's a piece that I do. There's the education piece, because there's different avenues for this death midwife work, but you can come into someone's life and make it applicable at any point in time. You don't have to have a terminal illness. You don't have to be caring for someone that's dying. The most mundane thing, the paperwork pieces of it, when we like map out like, hey, do you want to be cremated or not? Why or why not? Let's talk about that process. Let's talk about bodily autonomy. All those conversations, and then the education around, hey, let's say you are caring for someone who is terminal and it's hard and you need some respite support. Let's talk about the ways in which you can support them, but let's talk the ways in which I can support you as a caregiver, so that you feel more empowered when we come to that time. What do you need? Do you need education, or do you need someone to physically just do the dishes for you so you can spend more time with that loved one? What is it that you need as a caregiver to feel empowered around supporting this loved one during death? So it's asking those type of questions, and it's helpful to have an established rapport with a client, whether it be the client that is terminal or whether it be a caregiver caring for someone who is terminal. But it's not impossible to come into a situation, and I've been called into situations where it's like, hey, so-and-so's terminal and I've heard of you, but I don't really know you, but I'm feeling overwhelmed. Can we just have a conversation? And then I do some like quick intake, and again, try to help that individual feel empowered to do whatever it is that would help them, again, have more knowledge and less fear around what is happening, and then step in and maybe do those things that they might not feel comfortable doing or ready to do. So yeah, for me at the root, it's about education and letting people know that there are other ways of doing things. And so if your gut tells you that something doesn't feel right, if, funeral services, they're so expensive. And a lot of times our society equates money to love, and that's just not the case. And there are times when I've seen handmade caskets with pictures drawn on them, with different things done like that, where children are coloring their grandfather's casket and drawing pictures that they of them together. And those are the most beautiful things I've ever seen, not these $20,000 funeral scenarios, right? And if someone can afford that and that's what they want as a death midwife, I support it. It's non-denominational, and it's whatever my goals are, it's what your goals are. But to just educate people that there are so many more options than what is thrown in our face and what is advertised from the funeral industry. And then I think we'll really start to see that shift of people saying, man, I felt so powerless. I felt like there wasn't anything I could do to help. And to letting them know, like, hey, those tools, those things, they're all inside of you. I'm just here to like remind you. And then if I remind you and we have conversations and we learn some things and you're like, oh, but I don't know if I physically have it in me to like lift and move a body. I'm like, okay, well, I can do that for you. I can find people to do that for you, right? I'm an advocate. So if there's something you need that you don't have within yourself, or even that I can't provide for you, I will, as an advocate, go out and find the people who can.
Oh, I love that.
So
It's
it's this
really hard
all
to advocate.
encompassing.
It's really
Yeah,
hard to advocate for yourself and others when you're in the grief process. And those traditional funerals I found to be, westernized, more modern, in my experience, not very conducive to grieving. I mean, there's times I want to wail, right? Like I'm part Irish. I've got an Irish wailer. I'm definitely a grief walker. I mean, my last October, not this year, but last October mentorship, I had women in there who had lost children. One woman's husband was dying. I mean, I know like some, that death requires grieving, and that
absolutely.
there seems to be, for me, my experience was I wasn't able to fully grieve with those 20 or those $200,000, however, funerals, because people are crying. I would have looked ridiculous if I would have cried. There's silent crying, holding in your emotions, holding in your emotions. And then there's the process of after the death, right? That I think people could use more education and support around, because it's like after the
Absolutely.
funeral, people just ditch. My cousin lost her child. He was 11 years old, waiting for the school bus, and a semi hit him. And I just remember thinking, oh my God, like after the funeral, everybody just kind of left her to herself. I'm like,
Yeah.
we can't do that. We have to,
No.
this is going to be a
Right.
long grief process. She needs some
Right.
help.
Right. But it starts with, when obviously that death was an emergency, right? That was unexpected. Um, but it starts with with the expected deaths, with the non-emergency deaths. If we change and shift how we view, how we prepare and carry out those funerals, then we're better suited for the aftercare of those still left to grieve. When we allow in a funeral home or at home or anywhere on the streets the wailing to occur, hey, the grief is here in my body and it physically wants to come out, and we accept that, then we'll start to be able to see a shift in how we support others when they're grieving. Because we have this taboo, this fear around death. We also have, as a society, this taboo and this fear around really even though we all experience grief in some way, about letting that be shown, right? We're still very much closed off to letting that be a face that we show. And we have to tell our bodies it's okay. If we don't ever give our bodies permission, then it will fester somewhere differently for everyone, but it will fester. And so it starts at the vigil process. It starts at the funeral process of letting our bodies do what it needs to do, so that in that type of situation in the future, we don't have this uncomfortable sitting and like not know what to do to support that person who's just lost their child, because we're uncomfortable, because we don't really know what to do, because we think we've done all the things we should do. Oh, we went to the funeral. Well, that's just the tip of the iceberg for her and the rest of her life. And so we need to continue to work and hold grief circles and hold those containers and spaces, because that will change you for the rest of your life. All of us are changed by grief, and all of us will be impacted for the rest of our lives. It's not this, 5-step process. It's the 5 steps at any given day, all the time, some of the time, up, down, all around, for the rest of our time. Yeah, all rolled into one at all the time, right? And so I think we need to plan around grief, right? We plan around the moon phases, right? We do our rituals. We have the things we do. We plan around the seasons of the year for when we grow our gardens and our food and different things. Why not plan for grief as we start to shift into giving our bodies permission to grieve? So, grief comes up naturally, but what if we started to intentionally, like, okay, this time, around this time of year, around this month, we are going to intentionally hold space for grief, because then we start to tell our bodies, like, hey, our nervous system, it's okay to intentionally bring these things up, so that, when they do come up naturally, we do feel like we start to have some acceptance around it.
I love that. That's like a practice. Yeah.
Yeah.
Bringing up a container, because we need to continue to practice to know how to do it.
Sure.
It does naturally come up in October. I mean, there is definitely a correlation between all cultures around the world celebrating death, celebrating their loved ones, and then just this, if you're really in tune, it is like that. I feel it's almost like October 1st. I'm like, there's grief.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely.
And death and endings. I'm curious about your midwifery. Do you see, death is, I mean, we're having deaths all the time. We had the death of our entire way of living, right? In March,
Sure.
with COVID coming in, it's like, there's a lot of deaths in our life, not just the physical ones. I don't know if maybe you
Sure.
could speak to that too, or.
Yeah, so that's like what we kind of call like secondary death, right? When we think of death, we think of a person. Secondary deaths are like around money, around loss of any type of stability, your home, your friendships, relationships, anything that has an ending can be viewed as like a secondary death when it, affects us on a physical and emotional level. So yeah, there was a lot of secondary death occurring when COVID impact really, Ohio in particular, and the shutdown that we went through, people losing jobs, people losing financial stability, people losing relationships. So all those secondary deaths still have grief around them. And so that needs to be addressed too, right? And it's okay that your grief looks different than mine. And, you know, everyone's grief is just as important. It's, you know, maybe you lost a loved one, but maybe you also, maybe someone else lost their job. There are commonalities in that. And so just coming together to hold that container for grief and say, you know, it's not just about the physical death of a person. It's about even, you know, your own death as you transform from maiden to mother, from mother to crone, from married to divorcee, you know, like all those labels and all those hats we wear as women, men, everybody, you know, like those are deaths too. And so it's, again, important to hold space for the transition you make as you move through your life as an individual too. So yeah, it's not just physically dying in this body. There's so much more to it.
I love that. Beautifully said. And there's a piece to what I noticed is that a lot of times with secondary deaths, people have been taught to look out and to judge and to point fingers, especially I don't know if you've ever seen the like governor when he comes in to talk about COVID, people are like, "You're bad, you did this to me." And my hope
Yeah,
for society is when these secondary deaths happen, that the alchemy work really is inside, right? I mean, there's
sure.
things we can control on the outside. I love that. You talked about knowledge. You talked about preparing ahead of time. And of course, the physical forms. And then there's the inner, you know, working with the five senses, working with the somatic movement and the grief. And those are just as important with the second deaths. And as you mentioned, if we hold that in, or if we continue, I mean, probably part of the process is to say like something out there did this to me, but really
Absolutely.
gotta tap into how we're reacting to it.
Yep.
So what is a way, because we're all going to lose, if you have one, like we're all going to lose a parent, we're all going to lose, you know, loved ones. You said, so knowledge, definitely. Do you have any resource for knowledge for everyday folks? Should they get a hold of?
Yeah. So, you know, a lot of times, like every death midwife sets up their practice differently, and that's the amazing thing about it, right? It's holistic to what their skill set is and what they want to provide. So for me, I spend a lot of times, I like talking with people in person. I like talking with people one-on-one or in smaller groups. So I feel like I can connect a little better. So I like to hold workshops on different topics. Very specific topics like how to hold a home funeral, if you're interested in that and just want to know, like maybe that's not what you want for yourself, but maybe you're just interested in knowing. So I'll hold a home funeral workshop, or I'll do individual client sessions. You know, I'll do like my first meeting with everybody is always, you know, that's a whole kind of a different topic, but I typically don't try to charge for this work if someone has the ability to, but I definitely want to make this about community care. And so it's one of those things like, if you want to trade me tomatoes, I love tomatoes. So let's trade this death midwife work for some tomatoes as we like learn about this, right? So I'm very like fluid in how this information is shared. And I think it should be widely shared as much as possible. So I try not to put like, you know, a dollar threshold or a formal like workshop thing around it as the only way to access this information. But yeah, there's, you know, just having those conversations and it starts with it yourself, right? So like you said, everyone is probably going to lose someone and be a caregiver at some point, but let's focus on you at the moment, because you are also going to die at some point in your life. Maybe it's tomorrow, maybe it's 70 years from now. And so let's just talk about the most mundane, boring things, because those conversations just tend to spiral and grow into this beautiful conversation about body autonomy. If, you know, you and I were to sit down, Dawn, and I would say, okay, we're going to start our paperwork and we're going to do like the medical side of things. Who gets to be in charge of your medical stuff, your paperwork, should you be in a hospital and unable to speak for yourself? And then this conversation spins to like, well, Dawn, do you want to have a funeral, or do you want to have like a Viking pyre funeral in the woods where we chant and sing and we play your Shakti playlist and we have those going and everybody's dancing around you and honoring, like, though that's where the conversation always goes to, like, you know, this, like, it becomes so personable, right? And so when someone has found more acceptance around what they want for themselves and gets like that just like clicks that, oh, that made me feel good to think that this person's going to be maybe like caring for my body. And it made me feel really good that, you know, my favorite song will be played and that these people will think of me. And maybe I want some of my crystals buried with me. Maybe I want to make sure some of these are given to particular people. But there's a lot more acceptance around your own mortality. And then you feel a little more empowered to go out into the world. And when you're in the position to become a caregiver for someone else, there's a bit more strength I feel people have when they've accepted their own mortality to be in that role, to be a strong caregiver for whatever that person may need to.
Well, sign me up. I'm ready for you. We are, yes, I have all kinds of things. Tomatoes,
Right.
Christmas, we can trade. I am very intrigued with this work. And I'm also, I remember I had my first panic attack at age 7. I was afraid I was dying. And it was because I saw Stand By Me, the movie, and they found a little boy who had been dead for a long time. And you know what happened to me? A visceral reaction of just like, oh my God, kids can die? I didn't know that. And I went to my mom, and I mean, I've had this fear over death for a long time. And when I was a caregiver for my grandmother, watching the bile come up in the hospital, just the things that happen with the body, it's terrifying. So I'm ready. I'm ready to, even though I've been getting some lessons, like, working with the women in deep grief last year, like I'm ready to level up.
Yeah.
This is awesome. And I'm just introducing this work to people. Is there any last thoughts that you really want people to know about these topics, and then we'll talk about how to contact?
Yeah. So I think for me personally, my practice, what I want to share, it comes from these like Appalachian roots. It comes from very practical roots of when you live in the mountains 100 years ago, there was no way to really access an ambulance. Like literally you live on the side of a mountain and they can't get to you, or you couldn't afford it because my family was dirt poor in the mountains. And so caring for someone, caring for your own body, caring for your loved one, having the funeral there at home, and then burying them yourself came out of practicality. And so then when I started to, like you said, as children, we start to have these, either what we see on television or what we start to experience when we attend funerals. We see things that, and, we have these events that kind of create our perception of death and dying. And then we form, our body reacts to that, these feelings of anxiety over, like you said, not knowing that kids could die and having that visual versus like I saw how funerals were done in my family. And then I saw how funerals were done in like a stranger's family or someone, as I got older and, had to attend funerals for people who weren't related to me. I was like, well, why is it done like this? That's odd. And they're like, no, Lauren, you're the odd one because people don't keep dead bodies in their homes where we're from. We send them off to the morgue. And I was like, oh, okay. So it's my family that's odd. And that's when I really started to dive into this is all of that information that started to come to me as a young person. And then kind of stepped away from that, didn't really think much about it. Okay, people do things differently. That's fine. And then my real awakening to the work came about. First off, I had that like looking back, like I worked as a caseworker, mental health professional in the field for about 10 years, time and time again, mental health, there's so much to say about mental health. We won't dive deep into that topic, but if you don't ever address these socioeconomical issues that someone has in their life, you're not really going to address the mental health issues. If someone has depression because they can't afford to pay their rent, they need money to pay their rent, right? That's what would help alleviate depression, right? So support in that way. So I had a lot of clients who were taking care of their terminal adults, their parents. They've lost their asses financially, trying to provide what they thought was the best funeral for them. And so time and time again, I was wearing that death midwife hat, and I didn't even know what the term was because we didn't have the term in my family because it was just what we did. We just took care of each other. And then again, I let that go. I was like, okay, I didn't know what that was. And then I had my real awakening. I had never been afraid of death before. Very careless teenager, very didn't have much regard for my own life for much of my life. And so I had no fear around death because I didn't care whether I lived or died. And then I had my children, and my children came early, and there was a very traumatic birth, and they were not breathing at birth, and they struggled for quite some time. For about 3 months we were in the NICU, but the first month was the sketchy month where it was like life and death at any moment. And that's when I again had fear. I had fear for the first time around death. The only thing that brought me comfort, and this sounds so wild, but the only thing that brought me comfort and started to give me peace was that I found out through talking to someone that if one of my babies were to die in the state of Ohio, I can keep them at home with me. Like obviously I would call an ambulance. Obviously, I would want some intervention to take place. But if the worst happened and they passed, I could bring them home with me. They don't have to go to a morgue. They don't have to be left alone. And that was where a lot of my anxiety and my fear, to where I literally, every time I'd walk out the door, I would think either I was going to die or one of them were going to die. And I had this fear that I'd never had before. When someone told me that, hey, if something does happen, worst case scenario, you can hold your baby, you can bring your baby home, you can bathe your baby, you can have a funeral at home for your baby. You don't ever have to leave your baby through that process of letting their physical body go. And I was like, oh, and that's when it just was like, boom, head first, death midwife. This is where I'm meant to be and meant to do this work. It brought so much clarity to my life. I'm like, people need to know that they can physically care for their loved ones, and how much it improves and helps not just the loved one that's dying, but everyone in the relationship. And to be there, like, why would we not be there for someone we loved when they cross that threshold? Yeah. Nobody should do that. Nobody should do that alone ever. And so that's kind of like the root of everything, right? Advocacy and not being alone. And that's kind of what it comes down to at the core. So
powerful. Through birth, you alchemized
yes
death and found your path. That is amazing. Thank you so much for all this content and from sharing from your heart. So you're saying that it's legal for anyone. We're allowed. I didn't know that. I thought that I thought that you had to eventually turn the body over to someone else.
No, you don't. So again, you have a coroner come out, you have someone pronounce death, but again, it depends on the situation, right? Is the death an emergency? Is it not an emergency? But you don't have to have a body transported to a morgue. Once you have a death certificate, you can bring that person home and you can have a funeral at home. You don't have to depend on the funeral industry. You can, and there are ways that they're very helpful. And I work with some really great funeral home directors who are just really awesome, good people. But it's not the only path. There are lots of paths, right, for all things. And so this is just one of the paths for home funerals. And that idea helped me be at ease in the worst case scenario that I could play out in my mind. And I had to play it out, right? I had to play it out so that I could be at ease. And once I did, I was, oh, okay. I have some ease around it. And I feel more empowered. And so that's what it is to share. So yeah, there are a lot of misconceptions about what is a suggestion, what is normal practice versus what is a law and what can you actually do. Wow. So that's another piece that I can come in and help plan and wrap that around.
Well, I really hope it's legal. Actually, my family has talked about what we want, not to this depth. I love this education. Yeah. But me and my partner of 7 years, we are so Vikings. And I was like, God, I really wish someone could put me on a boat and then light the fire out in the water, the ocean. He's like, me too.
So that particular way of going is not legal in Ohio. But like you said, we'll talk about that more. We'll talk about that offline.
Good. We'll figure that out. Is there a social media or a website that you would like to share before we wrap up?
Yeah. So right now I just use my social media on Instagram. It's my, not technology savvy, friendliest way for me to just share education and information and have people reach out to me. So my Instagram handle is just exhale.midwife. That's all it is. And then I have an email address listed on there. It's the same handle, exhale.midwife@gmail.com. But yeah, that's the only platform that I use to kind of share education and awareness and have people reach out to me too. And so we can connect. So
perfect. I love it. Thank you so much for taking your time.
Thank you, Dawn.
And connect. And you have a wonderful, wonderful weekend.
Thanks, Dawn. Thank you so much. Appreciate you.
You too.